Welcome back to Ensemble Sewing Studio. In this video, I would like to help you sew a patchwork skirt. I did not use a pattern for this. I self-drafted, so I'm going to share my technique with you. This is what I call my purple prototype patchwork skirt. I wanted to experiment and come up with a plan to make myself a fall patchwork skirt. So I really have two different options for the skirt for you today. This particular skirt is about 27 3/4 of an inch long, and I'll give you a peek at what it looks like on. I also made a seamwork motto top to go along with the skirt, and I just think this outfit is so cute. I'm really happy with the way my prototype turned out, but for my fall patchwork skirt, I am going to lengthen my squares, and I'm going to use an even number of squares instead of an odd number of squares. So I used 5 squares for tier 1, 7 squares for tier 2, and 9 squares for the bottom tier. And I made a template, a 10 by 10 inch template. I found that this was much easier to use than to measure out each square with a ruler or on my mat into 10 by 10 squares. So I use the template. I can mark with my marking pencil and easily cut them out. This is a much quicker process. And I would mark around the square rather than, say, using your rotary cutter and cutting each square using the template, because you will end up shaving part of your template off. So this skirt uses only 10 by 10 squares. And after I got to the bottom tier, I realized I did not account for extra length for the hem. So you may want to add another 5/8 of an inch to your last tier to make a 5/8 inch hem. Instead, as I got to the bottom, I just made a very small 3/8 inch hem. I ironed over once 3/8 inch, and then I ironed over again 3/8 inch. I think that you can adjust the size of the skirt very easily. If you're a small, you won't have to make any changes to the measurements that I give you today. Because the waistband is larger than the waist, and the elastic is what pulls it in, and there's also the drawstring to also cinch in the waist. If you're a large, extra large, 2X large, 3X large, you can easily make your waistband longer, and you can add more squares to each tier. I'm going to focus mainly on the construction of the fall skirt with the even number of tiers in this video, but I will reference back to the purple skirt where I feel the directions are a little bit different. My goal with the fall patchwork skirt is to have a longer skirt, length of about 32 inches. And I want to have pockets in this one. So like I said, I have an even number of squares for the front and the back so that I can put pockets in. So let me walk you through the measurements and the process of cutting your patchwork skirt out. So I'm going to use the 10 by 10 template. This is just made out of poster board. And I have cut out 6 squares for tier 1. So I'll have 3 squares in the front and 3 squares for the back. In the second tier, I've made a 10 by 12 template, and I've cut out 8 squares, so 4 for the front, 4 for the back. And then the third tier, the bottom tier, I made a 10 by 13 template, and I cut out 10 squares. For the waistband, I have 2 pieces of fabric that I've cut 22 by 4.5 inches. For the drawstring, I'm going to have a piece 64 inches long and 2 inches wide. And because I found it easier, this is about a 44-inch wide fabric. So I just cut 3 pieces of this at about 22 inches each. And I'm just going to sew them together end to end because most of the drawstring is going to be inside the waistband and you're not going to see where you sewed the ends together. And then for the pockets, if you have another pattern that has a pocket piece to it, you can go ahead and use that. And again, you can just make yourself a template with poster board so that you just have a piece handy when you need it. If you don't have a pattern, it would be pretty easy just to draw yourself a pocket on the poster board. Okay, we're going to sew the first tier of squares together. If you're making version 1, you will want to sew your squares together on each side all the way around, so connect all of the squares into one circle. For version 2, the version with pockets, I'm going to sew my 3 front squares together, and then I'm going to sew my 3 back squares together. Be sure that you backstitch at the beginning and at the end of your stitch line. I have the first tier of my front sewn together, as well as the first tier of the back. These are the 10 by 10 squares for version 2. I'm going to go over to the ironing board, press my seams open, and then I will go to the serger and serge them separately. If you don't have a serger, you can finish your seams with a zigzag stitch. For tier 2, we're going to follow the same process. I have 4 squares for the front that I'm working with on my fall skirt and 4 squares for the back. I'm now working with the 10 by 12 squares. If you're making version 1, the purple skirt, you're going to sew the side seams together on all of your squares all the way around, making a circle. And now for the third tier, I'm going to sew my 5 squares of the front together. These are the 10 by 13 squares. And well, I guess not squares, rectangles, right? And then I will sew the 5 rectangles for the back together. Now that we have our tiers constructed, we're going to sew 2 rows of basting stitches across the top of each tier. 1 row at 1/4 of an inch away from the edge, and the second row 5/8 of an inch away from the top edge. I usually just use cheap white thread to sew my basting stitches. That way I'm not wasting my good thread on stitches that are just going to be taken out later. And it also makes that line of stitching more visible when you go to remove the basting stitch. Take both pieces of your waistband over to the ironing board and press in half. You'll then fold up one of the long edges, 3/8 of an inch, and press as well. That side of the waistband is going to fold over into the inside of the skirt, so if you have a directional fabric, you'll want to make sure that your pressed edge is on the inside. If you're going to be making buttonholes for the drawstring, I find it helpful to fold the waistband over in half again so that I can press a center line for positioning my buttonholes. I may also just stick a pin in here to help in alignment. I am now going to mark my buttonholes. Keep in mind that the pressed under edge is right about here. So this will be where the hemline is. So I want to center my buttonholes between this pressed edge and the top pressed edge. going to place them about a half edge from that center line that I made. And I'm just going to use the top of my gauge to figure out how large I want to make that buttonhole. We just need to run that drawstring through. And that line measures about 1/2 inch, 5/8 of an inch. Now I'll create a line for the second buttonhole. I now have my buttonholes marked. Buttonholes are not my favorite thing to do when sewing. I'm always really nervous about the whole process. One of the challenges for me when I have parallel buttonholes is getting them lined up side by side. So today I'm trying a new technique, and you're going to witness it here, but I put a piece of masking tape across the bottom here. And don't worry, I'm not going to stitch over that, but I lined it up to a place on my buttonhole foot, and hopefully when I make the second buttonhole, I can use that as a guide. Let's see how that works out for me. Okay, here's our first buttonhole. So far, so good. Trim off the extra thread. Okay, let's tackle that second buttonhole. Okay, let's see if these buttonholes are lined up. Yay. I am happy with the way these buttonholes turned out, and I must say my masking tape trick was a success. We are now ready to gather the stitching at the top of our first tier and attach the waistband. Begin by pulling your gathering threads, drawing your gatherings toward the center. I placed a straight pin in the center of the tier so that I can even make sure that my gathering stitches are even on both sides. Use your waistband as a gauge. I have a straight pin in the center of my waistband as well to help me align each side of the stitching. Now that the top of my tier is gathered, I'm going to place the waistband onto the tier, right sides together, making sure that the pressed edge of the waistband is on the outside. I have my front waistband clipped to my first tier. I'm going to go over to the sewing machine and sew the two pieces together with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Repeat the same process with the back waistband and the first tier of the back of your skirt. I have both the front and the back waistbands attached to tier 1. If you're making version 1, the purple skirt, you'll need to sew your waistbands together at the side seam with the 1/2 inch seam allowance before you attach them to the top tier, but then you will follow the same process as I just showed you here. The only difference is you will be working with 2 continuous loops as you are attaching the waistband and each tier. Once you have your waistbands attached to your top tiers, head on over to the ironing board and give the seam allowance a light press so that you'll have a crisp seam here at the top, but don't press so much that you press out your gathering. Also be sure that you have removed both rows of gathering stitches. Now you're going to attach your second tier to your first tier, following the same process that we did in attaching the waistbands. I would figure out where the center of my tier is and place a pin, like we did with the first tier in the waistband. And at the bottom of the first tier, and then with right sides together, you will place your first tier over the second tier, and then pull your gathering stitches into the center until the second tier meets the bottom of the first tier. Once you've completed that, you can do the same thing with the third tier. This project is really starting to come together now, isn't it? I've stitched all 3 tiers together on my front and my back, and I finished those seams on my serger. While I was at the serger, I also finished the edges of my pockets all the way around. It's now time to attach the pockets to the front and back of the skirt. With right sides together, place your pocket 1.5 inches from the seam where the waistband meets the first tier. Pin that pocket in place and stitch from the top of the pocket to the bottom of the pocket at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Before understitching the pockets, we need to finish the side seams of both of our front and back. So I'm going to use my serger. And here I am going to press the pocket away from the skirt. Then I'll go back to the sewing machine and also 1/4 inch away from the seam line. This is the understitching. Next, with right sides together, place the skirt front over the skirt back, making sure that your seams are all lined up. You'll stitch from the top of the waistband to the pocket, pivot at the pocket, go around the pocket, pivot at the bottom of the pocket, and stitch all the way down to the bottom of the skirt. After stitching up both sides of your skirt and pressing the seam open, fold your waistband over to the inside of the skirt along that pressed edge. Make sure that your seam is fully covered as you fold the waistband over. Begin pinning the waistband in place from the inside of the skirt. We're going to be stitching in the ditch, so we need to be able to see where those pins are and remove them as we go. I find it easier to stitch in the ditch using the zipper foot. Place your waistband underneath the zipper foot. Begin stitching right in that seam line. And when you get around to the other side, leave about a 2-inch gap because we are going to need that space to insert the elastic. Okay, I will be placing the elastic through the gap. I'm using 1.5-inch elastic for the waistband. To measure the length of elastic that you'll need for your skirt, wrap the elastic around your waist and pull it a bit until you get to the point that you feel it's comfortable. I'm going to cut my elastic right here. Place a safety pin at the end of your elastic. And begin threading the elastic through the waistband. Once you have reached the other side, remove the pin. Make sure that your elastic hasn't become twisted somewhere along the line. Then overlap your elastic. Go back over to the sewing machine and sew a couple of very secure lines of stitching. You can zigzag or you can straight stitch. Once you have secured your elastic, pull the elastic back into the waistband and then stitch up that 2-inch opening that we left in the waistband by stitching in the ditch. For the drawstring, fold the short ends up about 1/4 inch and press. This is the wrong side of the fabric on top here. Then fold over the long edges to meet and press so that you have a center line to work with. Then fold both of those long edges into the center line and press. Once you've pressed both sides all the way down to the other end of your drawstring, fold the drawstring over once again, back to where that center line is, and press. Then machine stitch 1/8 inch from the edge on both the short end and all the way down the long end. Then your drawstring is finished. Once again, take your safety pin, attach it to the end of your drawstring, and loop the drawstring through the waistband. My drawstring is in, and I've hemmed my skirt. I pressed the bottom edge up 3/8 inch, and then pressed it up again 5/8 inch, and then stitched about 1/4 inch away from the pressed edge. So that is it. My skirt is done. I'm going to try it on now, show you what it looks like. If you made the patchwork skirt, I would love to hear about your project. Feel free to tell me about it in the comments section. Also, if you've enjoyed this video, please hit the like button. And if you're not already a subscriber, please hit that button as well. Thanks for sewing along with me today.